Sohrab, you recently tweeted that revitalizing the legislative branch might be the most important political priority facing America in the 21st century.
And I added that sorry for offering basic Yuval Levin thought with a capital T.
Basic but fundamental Yuval thought. So Yuval, I'm at this moment where we have massive challenges with the administrative state, with political polarization, with populism that are causing challenges to the system. There have been some on the right and on the left that argued what we actually need is a strong executive to fix this problem. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, and in particular why it's really Congress that needs to be kind of revitalized, and sort of, if you could talk about kind of the genius of how the founders understood the separation of powers, and then obviously we're going to talk about Alexis de Tocqueville today, so how this then kind of trickles down.
For me, this actually begins from a thought that I take to be very Tocquevillian, which is that when we think about problems in our system of government, we have to think about what we're missing as much as what we have too much of. We have to worry about enervation, right? What is enervated? What's creating the vacuum that other forces are rushing in to fill? And when you look at the American constitutional system, the answer to that is plainly Congress. Congress is enervated, Congress is missing, and Congress has to be the driving force in the politics of a republic. That is just straightforward Republican theory of all sorts, right? And James Madison says, Federalist 51, in a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. I think the way to read that is not just to say that's what happens in republics, but that a system where the legislature doesn't predominate is not a Republican form of government. And so the solution to our problem can't really be to lean into the problem. It has to be to push back. What we're missing when we miss Congress, again, I think very much following in Tocqueville's wake of thinking, is we're missing a mode of citizen engagement that is representative on the one hand, but also allows for negotiation among the factions in society on the other. That's what you need to sustain a free society. And so I don't think that further leaning into presidentialism can be a solution to the problem we have. Congress has to be reawakened so that the system can find its balance again.
And were there times, obviously the progressive era was a time where this shift in balance moved to the executive?
Yeah, and look, I think in some ways we're seeing a revival of a certain kind of progressive mistake about the American system. The idea that the president can embody the will of the society, and that ultimately we need some combination of technocratic oligarchy with extreme democratic populism. Well, that is progressivism. And I think what you need instead is a way to find a balance between those two, to allow the democratic energies of the society to flow while also balancing them with certain kinds of institutional discipline. Either one by itself goes in the wrong direction. Democratic energy by itself leads us toward a kind of tyranny of the majority. Institutional discipline by itself really does point to oligarchy. I mean, that's what it is. And so I think we see both of these problems very much alive in our society. Our populism is answering real problems. It's raising real concerns that have to be taken seriously, but they have to be taken seriously by the American system. And that means that we do need a reawakening of constitutionalism.
Is it Congress must predominate in a republic because that's the only way that we, the people, actually govern?
Yeah,
we govern through our representatives?
I think there's two things to it. On the one hand, the legislature is representative, and if this is a democratic republic, then our government has to be representative. It has to somehow speak for our concerns. On the other hand, the way in which the legislature represents is by facilitating negotiation that couldn't happen among the people themselves, right? Our society couldn't just fall into negotiations among its factions, but a legislature is organized and structured to allow that to happen.
Where the executive is not.
Where the executive
might
not.
be able to represent,
executive is one
not.
person. One person can't negotiate on behalf of the society. I think we're very much inclined to this mistake, we all do this, to think that, well, the president is a representative, right? The president is elected by the entire nation. But one person can't really be representative of an immensely diverse society. Representation can only happen in a plural institution. The president is elected to be accountable, but I don't think the framers of the Constitution expected the president to be representative. That really is the job of Congress.
And so you put federalism would be another component of this?
Absolutely.
Just so the people can govern.
An absolutely central component by the same logic. Yeah, exactly.
I want to concretize what Yuval just said in a contemporary example, and to explain what prompted my that tweet that in turn prompted our discussion here, which is it was actually the tariff issue, right? So I don't want to get into the substance of whether tariffs are good or how to use them or whatever, but obviously the present tariffs failed at the Supreme Court. And I got to say, I was telling my friends in the administration around Liberation Day, like I happen to be an industrial protectionist. I think that project has deep, deep roots in the American tradition, going back to Hamilton. But it would have been better if that procedurally this was done through Congress, because first of all, it's durable, and it has this kind of push and counter push of power and countervailing power that can happen in the legislature. The agricultural sector can come in and voice its objections. Since the 19th century, American farmers have been opposed to tariffs, whereas, of course, manufacturing is for it. And that in that process of sausage making, and Yuval's right, that can't happen within the soul of one man, however kind of a popular and populist figure he might be. But I want to introduce a wrinkle. I'm going to open a box, and maybe it'll be easily closed or maybe not. That has to do with the text and its context.
The text being
of Democracy in America, which is that at the time that Tocqueville was traveling around America and making his observations, it was actually the rise of amid the rise of a very, very powerful executive, namely Andrew Jackson, who wielded the veto power like no predecessor ever had, who, and he gave a farewell address, which no predecessor had. And I'm saying that's a symbolic index of how he saw himself and how the Jacksonians saw him. He saw himself as a kind of second George Washington, first populist, founder of the Democratic Party as the party of what used to be called the democracy. And so in some ways, he uses this immense power for the first time in a robust way. For me, I think the emblematic case is the destruction of the Second Bank of the United States. He does it in a way because he wants to return power to local or state banks at the time, right? The pet banks, they used to be called. So there's this kind of paradox of Jackson coming strong executive. He's like a almost ghostly figure in the book, right? He's not that present. And as he at various points, Tocqueville says, well, it's interesting that I don't think presidential power will ever increase dramatically, and I'm worried about actually too much, decentralization. But in a way, Jackson was. The spoil system, this kind of a real sense of we have parties, I think begins with Jackson. But mainly, I mean, it's interesting. I think the roots maybe of a strong presidency go back behind the progressive era, I would say, to maybe the Jacksonians.
And Sarah, maybe we can come back to Jackson in a second. Maybe you could set the stage a bit, given that you're a Tocqueville scholar, about who is Alexis de Tocqueville, what prompted him to come to America, and what was he encountering here?
We hope you're enjoying Project Cosmos, conversations on the future of civilization. If you'd like more content like this, please like and subscribe or sign up for our newsletter, The Intercollegiate Review, in the comments section.
Who is Alexis de Tocqueville? What prompted him to come to America, and what was he encountering here?
Sure. Well, just quickly on the Andrew Jackson point, I think, of the people Tocqueville meets or observes very closely, is John Quincy Adams, right? Representative of a certain New England type, right? There's Charles Carroll, the last, signer of the Declaration of Independence, also representative of a particular, at that point, Southern aristocratic type, right? He didn't get to meet James Madison. This could have happened, right? It was a narrow miss. It's great shame for those of us who would have liked to have seen the results of that conversation. And so I think you can think about the questions that Tocqueville travels back to France with being, which type will America come to resemble, right? Now, Tocqueville is one of arguably two, thinkers that the American political tradition shares with the French political tradition, the other being Montesquieu, right? But you're hard-pressed to find a college student or a high school student who has read some Montesquieu, right? It's much easier to find someone who's read some Tocqueville, a chapter or two, maybe not the entirety of this big book, but a chapter or two. And so that makes him, I think, rather distinctive. He's also one of these figures who positions himself, I think, fairly between worlds, right? So among Tocqueville scholarship, we have all these strange ways to describe him, like a strange liberal or an aristocratic liberal, or there's a famous book, Between Two Worlds, right? And so he's poised really at the edge of aristocracy and at the beginning of democracy and trying to make sense of this. And that makes him a wonderful teaching tool with students, because he can see both clearly and teach you to walk through thinking philosophically about political and ordinary life, and observe how, as Lawler used to say, things are always getting better and worse at the same time, right? Just quickly on his biography. So he's born in 1805, dies in 1859. What I like to emphasize to students is how short a life that is compared to his peer group, right? John Henry Newman is born in 1801, dies in 1890. Mill is born a few years after Tocqueville, dies in the 1870s. Marx is born in 1818, dies in the 1880s. Leo XIII is born in 1810, lives into the 20th century, right? And so there's a lot of Tocqueville that, had he lived longer, we would have been able to read and think through and appreciate, but his life is cut short. So we don't know what he would have had to say about Lincoln, or the Civil War, or Vatican I, or the Paris Commune, all these things. He's born into Napoleonic France, to a Norman family. His great-grandfather was an Enlightenment-era reformer, an aristocrat, who famously came out of retirement to defend Louis XVI when he was on trial for his life. And as a result, many of Tocqueville's family lost their heads. His parents only narrowly escaped being executed, and that was because Robespierre got executed before them. And so this was the backdrop against which Tocqueville was growing up. He eventually becomes a lawyer, moves to Versailles and Paris, and spends time, becomes more of a liberal, as opposed to his family being much more conservative and monarchist. Travels to America in the wake of the July monarchy, the Revolution of 1830, which he later wrote was a pretext for getting out of France and thinking broadly about politics. I mean, he really had big political ambitions, right, as a young man, as a 25, 26-year-old. So he travels the United States for about 9 months, and, arrives in New York, goes up through Michigan, Boston, Baltimore, out west through Ohio, down the Mississippi, and then back up to D.C., and then has to go back home. Publishes Volume 1 of Democracy in America in 1835, Volume 2 in 1840, spends the next many years as a politician, right? So Dan Mahoney describes him as a thinker-statesman, as opposed to a Churchill or a Lincoln who would be a statesman-thinker, right? Ends up serving briefly in the government that's produced by the 1848 revolution. Napoleon III comes in, overturns everything again, and Tocqueville returns to his study, which is where we get the Ancien Regime and the revolution, and then he dies a few years later. So a rich life, but a relatively short life compared to some of his peers. And maybe that's a good jumping off point.
Yeah. What was the reception of democracy in America, I guess historically over the last 200 years, I guess?
I mean, really, well, so Volume 1 generally was a success just about everywhere. And I think we see in the introduction his intuition that everyone will like it, because he says he wants to see further than the parties, right? So he has this intuition that Democrats will pick it up, anti-Democrats will pick it up, right? Everyone will find something to glom onto in Volume 1. Volume 2 is much less well received initially, in part because people who are pro-democracy find less in it to support their cause.
By the end.
Right, exactly, and that's something John Stuart Mill actually notices. He says, Volume 2 is much more philosophical as opposed to sociological. It'll make it harder for people to understand, but it's actually, from Mill's point of view, the better of the two volumes.
And was it taken up sort of right away, or at what point in America were people really engaging?
I mean,
with this?
I'd say consistently there's a revival in the 20th century, and that's due both to what's happening in kind of American academia, but also French academia. There's a kind of revival happening in both places.
What specific era do you see it becoming a touchstone text?
I think that's really kind of consolidated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? So that's, I think, your first real, I mean, it's there throughout, right? But you have this sort of first neo-Tocquevillian movement really happening with Nisbet and Bella and all these authors who are picking him up and running with him in order to explain what they feel has gone wrong, but also to defend what they think needs defending against the Soviet order, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, and becomes by the middle of the 1950s, Eisenhower's speechwriters are making things up and attributing them to Alexis de Tocqueville.
It's
That's
like
really
a great
sign that he's become a
It's a great
known
American
quantity.
tradition to misquote Tocqueville.
Oh, yes.
Phil, what's sort of the relationship of Alexis de Tocqueville and Democracy in America to the sort of the Straussian kind of tradition of, political philosophy?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm still shaking in my boots when I've only learned that Tocqueville died when he was 54. So it's greatly concerning to me. I mean, you ask a big question about Tocqueville and the Straussian thinking, as if there's one sort of Straussian approach to things. But let me just say, for me, Tocqueville is actually what made me a conservative. And I think Tocqueville, the second half, the more philosophical part, the dark part, shows one of the pathologies of democracy. Yeah, maybe I can address your question this. Montesquieu, Aristotle, every great political thinker says every regime has its own pathologies. Monarchy, the monarch becomes too prideful, becomes too tyrannical. The oligarchy becomes too corrupt, the wealthy. What are the pathologies of democracy? And I think Tocqueville explains those as well, if not better, than any thinker. And he saw very clearly how, I remember reading for the first time and thinking, how did this man in the 19th century know what was going to happen in 20th century America and predict it so well on centralization, soft despotism? That's the part that made me a conservative. So in the tradition of political thought, I think Tocqueville is a sort of Aristotelian or Montesquieuian political theorist or political scientist, and he tries to explain to us the pathologies that democracy, he's in favor of democracy, I think, but if you want a democracy to be good, these are the things you have to worry about, right? Just one other point, Herbert Hoover gives a speech in Madison Square Garden, I think it's October 1932. So he's running against FDR. FDR has given his Commonwealth Club address outlining the New Deal. And Herbert Hoover, and I have no idea if he read Tocqueville, says the proposed New Deal will destroy the American way of life, the self-government of the people outside of the government. And I've always thought that, that is such a Tocquevillian theme. And Hoover saw it all. But I don't know if he read Tocqueville. Maybe in the 1950s he would have quoted Tocqueville. But I think he must have.
I think that sense that he illuminates something that sort of brings you into the deeper paths of conservatism was very true for me too. And it was striking to me I sort of first read Tocqueville as an undergrad, but really wrestled with him as a graduate student. I had a wonderful course at the University of Chicago with Ralph Lerner, where we actually read the Mansfield translation as the first people to read it. It hadn't been published yet, and he asked as a favor that we would find typos and things. And what really struck me in that reading of it was the way in which here was a kind of conservative friend of the liberal society who was worried about the right things. He was a liberal, but not in the way in which liberalism usually described itself. He wasn't interested in the Lockean thought experiments. That's not what he was really doing. In fact, the book begins with an introduction that gives you a kind of 1,000-year history of liberalism that doesn't even notice the Enlightenment. It actually is not that story at all.
The declaration is missing in the text.
And
it's not there.
It begins instead from Christianity, really, and from the conviction that human beings are equal, which he takes to be much more deeply rooted than we sometimes imagine. And from that works out the way in which a politics rooted in a commitment to equality has enormous promise, but also enormous challenges and risks. And that depth of understanding, which I agree is very Aristotelian. Tocqueville is very Aristotelian. He's like Burke in this sense. He doesn't really talk about Aristotle very much, but there's just no question that his mind was shaped by Aristotle's sense of what the human person is and what politics is for. And to apply that in such a deep way to really modern problems, I think is where that secret comes from, where you read it with students today and they think, well, this is happening. And you ask them, well, he said this in 1830, so what do we make of that? Was it happening then? Did he foresee it? Is there just a type of person that always thinks this is happening, which is kind of my worry, frankly, that this is just what, in every generation, this is how conservatives worry about liberalism. But it's all there in a very profound way that's not only political, institutional, but really digs deep into the human soul to find the sources of these problems, which is ultimately where they are.
I think takes very seriously the relationship between, we mores, right, but custom broadly and law, right? To your point about the self-governing needs to happen not just through political institutions, right? And sometimes when I teach Tocqueville on the habits of the heart and mores, I will pair it with a section from the Summa, which is my favorite question from the Summa on the relationship between custom and law, right? That custom is the context in which law is developed. Custom is the light in which we interpret law. It can undermine law. It can resist law, all these sorts of things. And I think Tocqueville is interested in asking certain questions along those same lines, right? That if we are to have a self-governing society that has a limited government, right, what other kinds of self-government do there need to be in order to make that flourish and thrive?
There's this remark I think will dovetail with what everyone has said, but there's a passage, there's a point where he describes this capacity for self-government outside formal state authority, where he says, if there is an obstruction or a hindrance upon a road, you'll see Americans gathering an assembly and sort of figuring out, and then some person is appointed as a kind of assembly foreman, and they decide, and they fix it before anyone even thinks to reach out to whatever state authority might have existed in that location. So I think still some nearly 2 centuries later, that still there's elements of that in American behavior. But, and I want to introduce some wrinkles here, already in the 19th century, that capacity was under threat because you have, and I think this is a tension that runs through the book, it's the tension between the Hamiltonian state that wants to weave together a national market. And that means, of course, bank. And the bank war is in there, and I mentioned it. We can get into it. I find it a very, very interesting episode, which could be a problem of 2026 too. Not the bank itself, but the shape of the structural shape of the problem. So the Hamiltonian state is ultimately a centralizing state. Bank, canal, credit system, tariff. And then you have democracy, and this is you can read this in Tocqueville, and then there are historians that I think make this point explicitly, rising in a way in reaction against this market state, this large centralized national market state. And you could read the Whiskey Rebellion in that light. You can read these various debtors' uprisings in the West, places like Kentucky that were precursors of Jacksonianism, where the entire different court system was set up to basically nullify old debts, notwithstanding the Constitution's prohibitions against government doing that. And then especially in Jacksonism itself, you can see again, it's the rebellion in a way, it's a rebellion of small against the central, or the local against the central, and he frames it that way. But you can also frame it as a rebellion of a kind of anti-market small d democracy is in there, by one reading at least. And the problems are still here, right? The problem of a large Hamiltonian state, when it infringes upon that capacity of people to do things for themselves, but that big state was also necessary for us to have a national market, and it's not easy to resolve. And at various points, I think he comes down in different directions about how the problem. I don't think there is to me at least, a unified voice through Tocqueville about how to come to terms with this problem of the Hamiltonian state versus local democratic reaction.
And how much of the Jacksonian, sort of the democratic rebellion, how much of that endured versus how much of that was then sort of overtaken by, I don't know, in the Gilded Age, kind of the industrialization and all that.
So, in terms of the solution of the democracy to this institution, which was doing important things, the Second Bank of the United States was ensuring a responsible flow of credit, but also disciplining credit. It was a very useful institution. However, it was also, as the Jacksonians complain, and I don't think they were wrong, it was also a kind of vehicle for the northeastern commercial establishment, for the very rich planter class of the South, and for manufacturers in the Atlantic, in the mid-Atlantic region, to the detriment of all sorts of others, workers in the Northeast, farmers in the South and West. That became the Jacksonian coalition. And so Jackson comes, and his answer is kind of Hulk smash. Jackson, in the famous veto of the bank's charter renewal, says government can't be for the rich, and this is an institution of privilege. And he always thought it was unconstitutional. So in the memo, which actually was written by Roger Brooktani, largely drafted by Roger Brooktani, he lays out his reasons for smashing it. And basically the United States, unlike comparable industrial states through the 19th century, does not have a centralized banking system. By contrast, France and England have much more centralized banking sectors. And it doesn't change until the establishment of the Federal Reserve in the early 20th century. But the problem is, and here's again, I think it's a Tocquevillian tension, and he saw it in embryonic form, is that once Jackson turned over the functions of the Second Bank of the United States to local pet banks, the state banks, there was all sorts of problems with that. They were not as responsible about how to lend. So there was actually a great inflationary spiral caused by wildcat banking. There was a kind of minor economic recession that it took a while for the nation to come out of. So, the small d democracy impulse, I think Tocqueville tells us, sometimes identifies the right problems, but the solutions it comes up with aren't necessarily up to the challenge, and sometimes they make things worse until the democracy figures out some other way to wield the same solution, but in a way that accounts for the earlier mistakes. And I think at the risk of conservative heresy, I think Federal Reserve is pretty useful, and it does the things that the Second Bank of the United States does, but I think with greater congressional control than the bank had, which bank was this imperious institution. It got a fifth of its funding from the U.S. taxpayer, but was very resistant to popular control.
Isn't the Depression sort of the key moment here, though, when our elite class, or the public, through the election of FDR, thought the system of deregulation ends in collapse, and so we must centralize. Someone must take care of the problem. That has to be the national government. We want our political leaders to do something when there's a crisis. And the Depression was a crisis like anything, and like nothing we'd seen before. You had to do something. And I'm going to speak really in general terms here. And then, World War II, and we win. And going back and reading the FDR in the 30s and then LBJ in the 60s, the presumption of what government can do, we're going to end poverty. And that's just the beginning. FDR says, the era of creativity and innovation is over. Now's the era of administration. And when you assign those speeches to the students, they actually audibly laugh. This sort of arrogance and presumption that we who are in charge can fix everything and know everything. But I think, I wonder, but they were responding to this more deregulated local economy, national government, really the state hadn't really been built. And that ended in the Depression. And then we won World War II. Like we did, the national government did do something. But it overshot the mark. And it seems to me that we had Reagan, but it really was the first one, maybe ironically, who's actually really said, no, maybe that doesn't work. I'm thinking of the Department of Education and things like that. So this is just a push your analysis further into the 20th century.
It's a very interesting, good question. And look, the arch kind of New Deal historian, Arthur Schlesinger, wrote The Age of Jackson, his great Pulitzer-winning history of not just Jackson himself, but the Jacksonian era, in part to spur the New Dealers to reform. And at the time, again, I'm not necessarily defending this, but the conclusion of the democracy by the time the era of the New Deal is the Jacksonian model, which in a way is a kind of very assertive Jeffersonianism, was incapable of dealing with the crises of the market system. So that, as Schlesinger famously put it, what we must use are Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. Like, so use the capacities of the federal government to bring about a government that protects the small in such a way that people can still live the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian ideal. But that in a situation of complexity, that requires some Hamiltonian muscular kind of state activity.
In practice, that built the administrative state that, to get back to Johnny's original question, that led to Congress no longer
Well, I think
governing.
it's worth seeing that this starts defensively, right? The original progressive case for centralization in government, it says the market is so powerful that there has to be a political response that's capable of answering the risks posed by markets. And this is where the progressives really begin to make the case for some centralization, even for Hamiltonianism. And Herbert Crowley uses this line, Hamiltonian means to Jeffersonian ends, in 1908. And he's making a perfectly defensive argument, not yet an assertive argument that says government can solve poverty, but rather we're facing this challenge from the market system. And I think there's actually a Tocquevillian insight here, which has always been hard for the 20th century and 21st century right to wrap its head around. Tocqueville thinks that, and actually Robert Nisbet brings this out beautifully in the 50s, Tocqueville thinks the market and the national government pose the same kind of problem. That the problem is centralized power, and that this problem can take private forms or public forms. And the big question is not, are you for the public sector or the private sector? The big question is, are you a centralizer or do you believe in the power of the people? And where Tocqueville sees the problem coming is with a kind of soft despotism that blurs the line between the government and market power. He doesn't have all these terms for it, but he sees it. He sees it coming, and he sees it in the Jacksonian era. I think the progressives begin from a worry that government isn't up to the challenge of answering the power of markets, but their answer is the government should be like these market powers. The centralization of private power requires the centralization of public power. they don't reach for something like Tocqueville's answer, which is that ultimately this power can only be managed by various forms of decentralization and by providing agency to the public. I think the centrality of agency is one of the ways that democracy in America is especially timely right now, because so much of our politics in this moment is about a feeling of an absence of agency in our own lives. Things just happen. And the American people feel like we have no control over this, where the economy is going, what's happening at the border, how the culture that's shaping our children, all these things are just happening to us. And the desire to reach for a political power that will give us control instead is very understandable. But I think ultimately what's actually necessary is much more like decentralized agency. And that's harder to make a case for when you feel like you're being threatened by central power.
I like to emphasize to my libertarian friend readers of Tocqueville, right, that soft despotism is not just the administrative state.
Right.
He says very clearly, the government becomes the chief industrialist, right? And so there's a kind of sharing of a certain science between industry and administration. Right, and as you said, a kind of coming together of those two. It's not merely administration, right? It's a certain form of power that is borrowed from a new industrial aristocracy, right? And this is just to, again, the scary stuff. I often ask my students when we read the soft despotism chapters, how would we know if we lived in a softly despotic state? How would we know? What would be the signs? Well, one of them is that you can combine soft despotism with the external forms of liberty, like casting a vote every few years, right? And if that's all the liberty that you have, it's not looking too good. It's not looking too good.
Yuval, I'm curious, so against the challenge of that you described, the progressives trying to address this challenge of sort of like the role of capital kind of dominating the American system. So the solution they proposed, or the way they were trying to solve that, was sort of having a government power that could check that. You talked about this Tocquevillian option of sort of decentralizing communities. I guess my question is how does the decentralized vision successfully check the power of capital, which probably will not be decentralized?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a role for public policy in sustaining that decentralization, right? And so if there's a role for antitrust, there's a role for a lot of what the progressives are trying to do. The trouble was they understood what they were doing as creating a kind of parallel central power to the power of in the industrialized economy, rather than thinking about it as creating ways to break down the power of the centralized industrial economy. They began that way, and some of them really did make that kind of an argument. But I think very quickly you find things bleeding into, well, we can do anything with public power, and it's legitimate because it's public power. And I think one of the lessons that Tocqueville offers us is the core challenge for any free society is always going to be the shaping of the souls of its citizens. That's the core challenge for any kind of society. And so you have to ask yourself, if this is what you're doing, how are you shaping the souls of your citizens? The problem with substituting centralized public power for centralized private power is that the effect on the souls of citizens is the same. The effect is a kind of loss of energy, loss of agency, loss of a capacity for self-government at the individual level. And if that's the problem we need to think about, then ultimately the progressive solution isn't really a solution. But it wasn't stupid. It was an answer to a very real problem. And it's a real problem that we still have to think about.
I would say in the answer of the democracy, as Tocqueville saw it and as the actual Democratic Party called itself in the early 19th century, the answer evolves, I think, is a dual answer. One is the progressive administrative answer, which can be very imperious. We're going to proliferate and of the famous alphabet soup of agencies. There's a problem. There's some, triple letter acronym agency that the New Dealers had set up to address it, and often all sorts of inefficiency, all the proper critiques of progressive administrativism that conservatives have lodged ever since, and they're perfectly legitimate. There was another thread, which is what government should do is to try to serve as an umpire by raising up the countervailing power of other social sectors besides capital. So that I don't think the National Labor Relations Act, which Congress explicitly said the goal is to promote collective bargaining, and some of the other activities of the New Dealers setting up, electricity co-ops, farmer collectives, et cetera, things like that are not collectives, farmers sort of price negotiation mechanism and so on that is slightly government supported, are the same as the barrage of administrative agencies. I think that kind of work, you're saying, look, there's going to be big capital. It's inevitable. In some cases, big capital is rational, right? Why? Because you have increasing returns to scale when you have factory effects. That's why we don't have mom and pop tire manufacturers or car manufacturers. It has to be done at scale. And there's also network effects in networked industries. The total antitrust sort of view doesn't make sense. It's really irrational if you have 200 towns to connect them using 100 different rail lines. It makes more sense to have 2 or 3 kind of regulated regional monopoly rail lines or national even regulated monopolies or cartels. But as long as the consumer, the worker, et cetera, are empowered relative to the big. And so I would separate that. I think, to me, that's perfectly Tocquevillian to come up with other mechanisms for checking private power that are actually, in a way, are market actors, right, themselves. But by banding together, they are able to bargain in a way that is less lopsided than if they were to go up singly against the big market actor. That I would separate from the very administrative model.
I was just going to say, he describes them as the democratic version of aristocratic persons, right? They become a kind of corporate body in the way that an aristocrat in the Estates General in France was part of a corporate body, right? Representing a group of interests.
Yeah. But the problem is, though, you have, so corporate power, what we've been referring to as capital, dominates, and so you need a countervailing power, which becomes the state.
Not the state. Well, it would be like labor unions, civil society, consumer co-ops.
Okay, but it's all these are cultivated countervailing powers through the state, and the state itself then becomes an actor. And what happens is corporate power and state power merge. And where this happens today is elite higher education. A perfect example of state power, corporate power. I mean, it is the modern day oligarchy. And I just think it was a mistake from the beginning to think we can fight the rise of private power, corporate power, with the rise of the state, and the state is going to defend the little guy against the corporate power. That corporate power is and I think young conservatives are naive. They fail to see that. That corporate power is always going to get control of the state. And wokeism, which was, and this gets to Yuval's point about the regime shaping the souls of its citizens, wokeism is the perfect example of the unification of Harvard, a private corporation that we now see was funded dramatically by the state. The Harvards are always going to get the state money, and then imposing a vision on the people that the people themselves do not want. I think that is the legacy of the rise of the administrative state. It is wokeism. And I will say, I think Tocqueville says it's always going to lead to wokeism.
Well, I don't think he says that literally, but even taking your point, I think the problem is that the merger between capital and state, or corporation and state, had already taken place. That was the complaint of the Jacksonians about the Second Bank of the United States and various other elements of the Hamiltonian state. So markets don't grow on trees. They are creations of law. And so the United States had set out to create a certain kind of national economy, and that required not just protecting private property rights, although that's certainly part of it, including like preventing states from altering the terms of loans in the Constitution, but also like canal, bridge, all the things that I mentioned, that was already taking place. So the idea that there was this pristine state in which state and market can remain apart, and then the kind of progressives or Democrats or whoever came and created this distinct, merge the distinction between the two or erase the distinction between the two is
but the
that didn't exist.
Yeah, the examples you point to, though, are arguably sort of natural monopolies: canals, roads, electricity, but not education, which is not a natural monopoly, which would be much better if it was decentralized. And so now how you determine, where the state, look, it doesn't make sense to have 100 electric companies. Agreed. But it also does not make sense to have one federal or national school system, right, dictated from Washington, D.C. That certainly does not make sense. Whereas if there's going to be governmental money in education, which I think is reasonable, the very best solution from the beginning would have been to turn it over to parents to prevent centralization. And yes, it's going to, all sorts of schools will make bad choices and fail, but at least the failures are limited to a local community that can learn. When the failures come from the top,
I think this, in a way, always comes to what problem are we trying to solve? Is the problem that the wrong people have centralized power, or is the problem that centralized power can't work? And there's always a tendency, and we are all liable to this, to just think, well, if we had the power rather than they have the power, then we would use the power well. I think part of what Tocqueville's telling us is that if we think in terms of how we are forming the souls of democratic citizens, centralization is a problem. It's not totally avoidable, but it is a problem. And to identify it only as a problem when the government does it, or only as a problem when markets do it, is to miss the nature of the problem, so that we should want to lean in the direction of decentralization of power that allows for agency. It's not always possible, but I certainly think that when it comes to education, for example, which is at the core of forming the souls of citizens, the necessity of that kind of decentralization really shows itself. It's not always easy to do, but I think if we see that that's what we're trying to do, then we can be in a better place to avoid the temptation to just say, the problem is that they control the centralized power, and now that we won one election, we control it, and therefore it's not a problem anymore. It just doesn't really seem to work that way in the long run.
So just the point about the umpire state that helps raise up the countervailing powers of other social elements. So in the late 19th century, the Hamiltonian state, one of the things it did was workers would organize to try to bargain collectively. The state was not involved. This was essentially a perfectly Tocquevillian voluntary activity. However, pre-New Deal judges would say that would strike down their ability to do that. So that already
Why
isn't.
When they strike it, they'd say it's like a cartel or what?
Yeah, exactly right. Or that they have to deal singly with the employer, and to do otherwise is overstepping. Or the employers themselves would have what's called yellow dog contracts, which means that in the employment agreement there is a provision that says you cannot bargain collectively or seek to form collective bargaining units, and the courts would uphold that as kind of private contract. But the act of the court doing that is government action in favor of one side of the national economy and over against another
side. I think
side.
it's important to see the way that this has evolved, so that by our time, the labor unions exist to lobby the government. That's what they do. They're national organizations based in Washington that lobby the national government. I think the form of labor organizing in the early 20th century and even the middle 20th century was very constructive in American life. And I think there's an enormously important role for worker organizing.
So
but
we can go into why that is. I think that's partly right about some unions. Depends on the sector, depends on the union. But I'm just pointing out, contra my friend Phil, that there was a time when, again, state was pristinely, in a pristine state, separate from corporate activity, and then it was the progressives who came and changed them. What the democracy responded to was this sense that already the market is a product of state action, whether it's judicial action, whether it's the kind of developmentalism of the Hamiltonian state. And the response to it, I think, is to try to protect yourself in a collective way. And that collective way needn't be state-led. It needn't be an administrative agency to come do this and that. It's to set up.
The public sector unions are the end result. With a force, no doubt, that has been good for teachers, but it's led to a catastrophic system of education. And look, I'm
not in favor of public sector unions.
No use to getting too far in the weeds on this, but that is the great public sector unions are a great example of a fear Tocqueville has of centralization, right? And I think we have to be very careful to think that we can manage state power. We can precisely calibrate the right sort of state power, so we foster the exact type of unions we want, but never allow public sector unions. There's nothing in our historical...
So you're against private economy unionism?
But there's nothing in our historical experience that leads us to believe, leads me to have confidence that once centralization starts, it can be stopped.
But what I'm saying is centralization was already in place. It was just it created a power dynamic that was very lopsided. And so what happened in response is actually an organic movement of people coming together and saying, if you want to hire for this job, you have to bargain collectively with us, right? So that because otherwise, given that in most industries, you don't have a plethora, even already by the time Tocqueville was writing, already you were having centralization in most markets, in most sectors, right? By the late 19th century, almost all sectors except agriculture, the same firm controls either 70% of the market, Otis Elevator, 90% of the market, British American Tobacco, et cetera. When you have a situation like that, to say that people can, bargain on a fair basis. And by the way, I don't want to make this about labor theory, but I'm saying this is a very Tocquevillian institution of labor union, is not possible. You can't bargain when it's a monopsony. The buyer of labor power, there's only one. And if you don't want to starve, you have to deal with it. I think a lot of the attempts of the New Dealers, where Tocquevillian, is to raise up countervailing powers organic to society. In other cases, I fully grant you, a gazillion administrative agencies that think they can regulate every corner of life in a rational way. Totally wrong. And much of that has received a lot of conservative pushback. Much of it is, I would say, defanged now. But I just want to separate the two forms of response to what is already this alliance of capital and state.
I remember a conversation that we had, actually, I think it was on a different ISI podcast, and you used the phrase democratic soul. Mm-hmm. And that phrase just stuck in my mind. And I'm wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that in light of Yuval's comment about the way that centralizing power shapes souls. And then Phil, given your work on religious liberty, if you could talk about what is the democratic soul at prayer, and is that different than the medieval soul at prayer or the ancient soul at prayer? And
I'm going to move in the direction that you just suggested, but starting from this question of centralization and decentralization, right? To say we want decentralization means we already have centralization. That means we're already within a particular kind of system. And in this, I follow my mentor and a colleague of mine at Catholic University, Russ Hittinger, who does a lot of work in social ontology, and I think makes the point really well that subsidiarity is not decentralization. Right? Subsidiarity is a different kind of thing that has to do with the right action being taken by the right people with authority at the right level. And so subsidiarity can lend itself in some situations to a kind of centralization at the right level for the right thing, and to less centralization, right? Devolution and decentralization says that the power belongs in the center. And that's not subsidiarity, right? That the power or the agency to do a particular thing lies with those most intimately touched by it, right? McIntyre has this wonderful point in Independent Rational Animals where he says, like, localism isn't the greatest thing either, guys, right? We all have local communities that can be pretty tyrannical, right? So let's not praise local communities unnecessarily, right? And so part of the danger to the soul, generally speaking, under a condition of extreme centralization beyond what might be appropriate, right, is a certain conditioning to abandon those activities and domains of life over which, properly speaking, you ought to have agency, authority, input, free will, right? And this is something Tocqueville says very clearly in the famous and haunting passage on soft despotism, that they gradually lose the use of their free will little by little, right? And so, some Tocquevillians, I have a pet theory that people are attracted to reading Tocqueville because they have a kind of anxiety over whether they have an aristocratic or a democratic soul, right? And so, I have some friends who are also Tocqueville scholars who really reject the idea of us all having democratic souls, right? And we've been raised in a democracy, right? Our default is a lot of these democratic points of view.
Why is it the soul? I'm curious about that. Why isn't it democratic habits, a democratic
or the mind, like the conservative mind, something like this?
Yeah,
well,
I'm curious,
I think this is Tocqueville rejecting certain kinds of Enlightenment liberalism, right? One of my teachers, Harvey Mansfield, says that one of the things that makes his liberalism distinctive, it's liberalism with soul. Mm-hmm. You have to imagine it in Harvey's voice, liberalism with soul, right? And I mean, Tocqueville's a student of Pascal, and in that way, a kind of neo-Augustinian in moments, right? He has a great appreciation for the aspirations, the dreams, the yearning for the transcendent. There are passages in Volume 2, Part 2, where if you were to take it out and say, is this C.S. Lewis or Tocqueville? It might be you might throw it up, right? And so the fact that Tocqueville is interested in the way in which a regime forms a soul, again, makes him a strange kind of liberal, because a lot of liberals are going to claim that the job of a regime isn't to form your soul. It's not going to form your soul. We aim to have it as little, impact your soul as little as possible, right? But it's sort of inevitable, right? Law's a teacher. No,
this is the Aristotelian elements of Tocqueville. I mean, he sees correctly, I think, that every regime shapes the souls of its citizens. That is inescapable. Even a regime that tries to be neutral itself is shaping,
becomes neutralizing.
Teaches us all to be indifferent and lack conviction, or have convictions only about being neutral,
or only about fairness, or something like this.
I think you can't beat something with nothing, and I think one of the difficulties conservatives have had over the years, and I credit Sohrab and my colleague Pat Deneen with helping us see this, is conservatives have talked for generations about liberty, individual liberty. Fine. But that doesn't answer the question, liberty for what? And the real virtue of a liberal democracy, or the quintessential modern American virtue, I would say, is responsibility. We ought to be, our regime ought to attempt to create citizens who are responsible for themselves, for their family, as much as possible, in their capacities for their community. And so this ties to religious liberty in the following way. The state isn't responsible for the citizens' religious beliefs. Churches and church authorities are. And so here the role of the state is to step back and remove itself, or not enter this area, to create the space for churches and individuals in their churches to assume their responsibilities, to do their duties. And so the virtue, because every regime ought to or does promote certain virtues, the real virtue of a liberal democracy, of the founding, even though the founders perhaps didn't use this language as much as they should have, is the language of responsibility. And I think what I see in Tocqueville is, we talk about agency, and agency is the lack of agency is a lack of responsibility for oneself. so whether it's education, I mean, I think that should be our sort of architectonic virtue, or one of them. Like, how is this public policy, is this agency, or is creating this agency or removing this agency, will it help citizens and communities become more responsible to live the sort of lives that they ought to be living? And here freedom is an essential element. To exercise the virtue of responsibility, one has to be free. And that also means you may not live as well as you should have. I mean, that's what it means to live in a free society. But the aim is not freedom per se, the aim is responsibility.
Yeah. You know, there's a way where Edmund Burke, in criticizing the radicalism of his fellow Whigs and of the French, he says they answer all vices with the all-atoning name of liberty. And he's a great friend of liberty, but the idea that liberty is an answer to every social problem that just says, well, freedom, is not a way to think about society, because ultimately there has to be a bigger picture about, again, what kinds of people are we trying to form here? And what does the next generation need to have from us? I think that kind of question necessarily points to responsibility. Responsibility really is a wonderfully American word. It actually used to be the case that the Oxford English Dictionary said the first use of responsibility in English, it's older in French, but the first use in English was from James Madison. And then they found a much older use, which is very inconvenient to me. But the idea that the way that we think about public life begins with a sense that it's ours, it's us, right? It's we. It's the Constitution's first word is we. That amazing declaration's second paragraph starts with we hold. It's something we have to do together, and you can't think about politics as something other people are responsible for. You can't think about social life as other people's problems. I think that really is the essential virtue of a free society. And as you say, it's a free society. You need freedom for that, but you need freedom for that, to be the kind of person who approaches the future as your own responsibility.
And this gets you into kind of virtue ethical territory, right? Yep. Again, there's a wonderful line that Josh Mitchell makes a lot of, I think, appropriately in his work on Tocqueville. Sentiments and ideas are renewed, the heart grows larger, and the mind expands by the reciprocal action of men upon one right? And that's pre-political, right? He's such an amazing stylist, right? The despot doesn't worry. This is not in the section on soft despotism, it's earlier in the section on individualism. The despot doesn't worry about you loving him so long as you don't love one another, right? Yeah. And so there's a way in which I would maybe use the language of, responsibility captures one side of it, but there's also something participatory, right? And allowing yourself to be shaped by that participation, right? That you then carry over into other domains of life, right? And so there's, again, Joshua Mitchell's language is spillover effects between these domains of life. They're impermeable, right? We move between them because that's the kind of thing that a human being is. We move between these domains of life, and we don't abandon our habits when we move from one to another.
Two thoughts which aren't related but are spurred by my colleagues' remarks. One is just to focus on how he describes the American aristocratic soul. And he basically says that the American aristocrat, because he's been so alarmed by the rise of the democracy, is withdrawn from politics in some ways, and relishes his private life. He goes to his opulent home, but when he goes outside, he says he has to be extremely humble. And there's this passage where he says, "One imagine what it's like when he shakes hands with his cobbler, and the contempt he has for him."
Imagine people coming up to you in the street and saying hello.
But he has to say hi to him and shake his hand. What's going through his head? One imagines the disgust. I can't remember what the word is. Contempt or disgust. But that's a very real thing that was happening at the time. In an earlier era, the Federalists were quite openly the party of a kind of American aristocracy. It was obvious that lots of the rabble shouldn't vote. Are you kidding me? And you still get that in the early Jacksonian age in the reactions of some of the like surviving Federalist grandees. The party isn't even around anymore, but you see letters where they're like, well, liberty is over. This uncouth figure, Andrew Jackson, has come around and is allowing all these people who have no business participating in public life to participate, which leads me to maybe a segue to the virtue ethics part. I loved how Sarah said the virtue ethical dimension of Tocqueville, which is nurtured by participation. I think there's a lot of this we could say that is a volume 1 where he's just defending the political animal. And he's reveling in the fact that Americans get to be political, not just in the big, like going to parliament or passing laws or writing newspaper articles, but in the way that I mentioned at the beginning, that they're like, okay, there's a hindrance on the road. Yep. We're gonna like fix this politically. And that's the fact that in a way he's a virtue ethicist is a thought that I really appreciate Sarah mentioning. It's kind of
my
true.
my forthcoming book when I can manage to get it out. But
yes,
on
I can't
this
wait
point,
for it.
But on this point, there's a line in the Ancien Regime and the Revolution that I think, again, you could write a whole book on in its relation to democracy in America, which was the medieval parish became the New England township. So there's something that he sees towards the end of his life as fundamentally medieval, a different form of liberty in the kind of the township existence, the township life of America, right? That I think maybe helps to explain some of these tensions that we're talking about between the kind of state and centralization and an older form of liberty that endures in some places in American life for, a century or 75 years or something like this.
I think there is a way that he's looking for a mixed regime in a way. He's looking to preserve the virtues of the aristocracy while he fully sees the vices and is glad that they're gone. And so he's always sort of praising these little pockets of aristocratic habits in American life. The lawyers who are preservers of tradition in a democratic society, and these ways that local communities sort of function like they play the part of aristocrats in Britain. He knows they're countercultural, but is sort of hopeful they can survive just to sustain some of those virtues. Democracy by itself has a lot of vices that have to be answered by these virtues.
When Tocqueville talks about religion, he seems very hopeful. He says, religion can thrive on its own. In fact, it will thrive if it's more disconnected or separated from the state. And he says, for the purpose of the political community, it doesn't matter exactly what religion the Americans practice, just that they practice a religion. And all religions in America teach the same morality. And when I was last teaching this, a student said, that's no longer true. And if it's no longer true, what do we make of Tocqueville thinking that our moral habits can be cultivated outside of the state through various American religions? But if the religions themselves don't, if Americans are not religious or decreasingly religious, or if the American religions are just, if progressivism itself can be considered a religion with a very different morality, what do we make of that? And I didn't have a good answer for my student. Would Tocqueville say the same things, and would he have the same confidence of the ability of religion to nurture the morality that a democratic people need?
I'm going to make briefly the optimistic case drawn from a passage that I like triple underline every time I encounter it. And it's now, I plug my book, I have a book coming out on normality and why it endures. And one of the dimensions of normality that I think are irrepressible is just the people's religious impulse. And there's a line in there where he says that atheism or irreligion are the exception, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, but religion is the default, is the natural impulse. And now that raises a discomforting question, which I don't have an answer to. Really, just doubling down on your question are various things that we're seeing that have in today's America, that have the qualities of religious action and behavior, but are explicitly not religious or claim to be not religious. Is that does that leave Tocqueville vindicated? Is that an optimistic fact about our life, that even the people who are opposed to religion in a way have to, it can't help but articulate who they are and what they believe in quasi-religious or even explicitly ritualistic terms, like you can think of the Black Lives Matter liturgies, the kneeling, the kind of public confession.
Environmentalism
has huge kind of, and so how would Tocqueville read American religion in 2026 when we're recording? I don't have an answer to it.
In some sense, I see those are some, at some level, like outgrowths of a certain Christianity, but there's sort of heretical element where they're emphasizing one thing, like
at the
expense of the others, or the environment.
And that's what Tocqueville says we're going to do, right? That we love vague general ideas. We love to make a system of them. We love to, he says, we have a temptation to pantheism because of this, right? He even describes centralization in the same way. We love a kind of uniform law that we just impose on the matter, right? And
connect that to the temptation to pantheism. What does that mean?
That out of our love of equality comes certain intellectual tendencies, right? And we want, therefore, everything to be just about as equal, just about the same.
Democracy
right?
of religion, everything is
right.
sacred.
Yeah. I think on some of these points, right, you have to disentangle, because when we speak about religion in Tocqueville, right, we're speaking about Christianity specifically, but we're also speaking about religion as a kind of social good with practices and rituals and all these sorts of things. So I think you can say, well, I think Tocqueville, would say that any society needs some form of religion understood as practices that bind you together in a kind of, this is somewhat Augustinian, right? I think the deeper question that you're pointing at, right, that we're kind of narrowing in on, right, is what if the first principles of the religious experience of a community change over time, something like this? And how does that sit with the laws and the other customs and things that have emerged out of it?
So one thing that's different now, and this is not so much at Notre Dame, but when I teach at other places, there's a whole generation of students that it's not that they've rejected the religion of their parents, they just don't have anything, no biblical knowledge, but no grounding in a tradition.
And are they Catholic by sort of baptism? Or
all
not?
sorts of things.
Yeah.
Catholic for sure, also Protestant. I mean,
there's no shortage of this in Judaism.
Yeah. The parents were faithful. The grandparents were very faithful. The parents, grew up, and if they're Catholic, they got baptized and confirmed, and then.
Not wanting to impose on their children, they left them starving.
My generation, 54, about to die, like Tocqueville. My generation, like we all, to put it in Catholic terms, we all were baptized and went to First Communion, maybe received the sacrament of confirmation, but our parents stopped bringing us to church around middle school or high school. Now they're the parents, and their kids have no religion whatsoever. And that's such a phenomenally interesting just sort of social fact. And I'm not sure how Tocqueville's analysis applies or does not apply when you have a certain segment of the population, and especially in our blue cities, that just don't really have religion. I mean, maybe they do in different ways, in these different forms, whether it's sports teams or political causes. But I just don't know. What we need is a Tocqueville to explain what will hold us together as a people when religion is no longer that
I think there's a way here that the good news is the bad news with him, right? The hunger for religion really is permanent and universal. The trouble is that hunger doesn't feed itself, and there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways, so that the worry shouldn't be that everyone will abandon religion. That just isn't likely to happen, because we all feel the need that it meets. But how is that need met requires institutions that are grounded in tradition and ultimately grounded in truth And in the absence of those, we're going to meet that need in other ways, which are just not going to be as healthy.
And how would you, in terms of strengthening those institutions, is it, how do we reform in an age that has more of a revolutionary mindset towards institutions? How do we
look, I think that in some ways it's a mistake to think we have a more revolutionary mindset. The religions that succeed with younger people are the ones that make demands of them, that don't just say, you're wonderful and are loved, that's important, and you are, but that say, this is demanded of you, this is what's required. I mean, literally in my tradition, this is what you can eat and what you can't, and too bad. Those are actually more attractive in 21st century America to younger people than the religious communities that take it easy on believers and just say, be nice to each other. So that suggests to me that we're not quite right to think that younger people just don't want authority. I think that's almost the opposite of what we're learning from younger Americans in the 21st century.
And Britons as well. In both Britain and the United States, there's some people can overstate its extent, but it's called the quiet revival. I certainly see it when I go to Mass in New York City. Like, doesn't matter which. I mean, I have my own parish, but I try other ones from time to time. All of them seem packed all the time with young people, and the survey data show that is what we've all just said, that young people typically gravitate within their broad traditions, whether it's Judaism or Christianity, toward those sub-denominations that emphasize more demanding moral aspects and more traditional or reverent liturgies. Now, I think this kind of genre of new believer, and there's also the kind of unchurched or semi-churched believer, is a real challenge for all of our faith communities, because they can also be ideas of faith in a kind of half garbled form without an authoritative guidance, which Tocqueville takes for granted, can be dangerous. Sort of cockamamie ideas can spread.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that in terms of the religious authorities, people wanting to establish more rigorous kind of practice. But I guess with other institutions, whether it's the academy, whether other institutions that especially young Americans have lost faith or hope in, how do you propose kind of revitalizing them?
I mean, look, obviously there's no easy answer to that question, but I think broadly speaking, there too, what's appealing is the promise that you will be shaped to be a better person. I mean, if we think about the way in which Americans have lost confidence in institutions, the great exception at the national level that stands out in every survey is the American military. And the U.S. military very self-consciously, in the wake of Vietnam, rebuilt public confidence in itself, not by persuading the public that it could win wars. That's not actually all that evident in our history, but by persuading the public that the military forms respectable and honorable men and women. That's actually how the military approaches the public. If you think about how they recruit, it's about the few, the proud, the Marines. It's not about how our wars have gone. And the idea that this is an institution that makes people into more admirable and serious human beings is actually very effective. If somebody tells you now that they went to Harvard, you would maybe think, well, that's a smart person, they got into Harvard. If they tell you they went to the Naval Academy, you think, well, this is a serious person, not because they got in, that's hard too, but because that's what the Naval Academy does, is it makes serious people, or at least that's our understanding of it. I think if more institutions approached the public in that way and said, well, what we do is we make serious people who are engaged in this particular occupation or profession or line of work, it's not how any institution thinks it wants to be heard, but I think that actually is a lot of what the American public looks for. Trust in institutions has to do with the sense that they form trustworthy people. There's just no way around it. That too is a kind of aristocratic way of thinking. I mean, it runs against some of the grain of democratic life, but I think it's how we need to think.
And the least effective kind of military recruiting, by contrast, is when a while ago, and then it's gone actually, thank God, are the ones where the military says, "Come join the military. We'll pay off your loans. We'll do this."
An army of one.
That's right.
An army of one. That's actually the opposite. The army of a nation.
Yeah.
Right. But another note of Tocquevillian optimism, similar to the military one that you've all highlighted, is actually in drug prevention and drug treatment among young people. The most effective programs are not ones that where someone goes to the school and says, I was an addict and it was terrible. Like, the most effective recent drug interventions that in the most affected communities, for example, in Appalachia, where opioids are a problem, fentanyl is a problem, are ones in which we've borrowed this from Iceland, apparently, which had this problem and they solved it, is where you give young people activities to do, where it's, instead of your time being, spent whatever you want to do, but occasionally the school or the police or whoever lectures you or disciplines you or punishes you, we are going, nonprofit, in a very Tocquevillian way, we're going to take you kayaking. And it works. Right, those kids. I mean, I can't remember the statistics, but they're dramatically less likely to pick up drugs, or if they're doing it, they're less likely to do it as severely, and so on. So, there are these green shoots everywhere you look, even in 2026 America, that vindicate the kind of virtue of participation as he saw it in such a rich way in the early 19th century.
Can I ask you both of your last comments about institutions shaping people and the particular examples here? But in a way, we just went through in our universities institutions that really wanted to shape people in all sorts of pathological ways, right? And I think a lot of, especially the young men, are reacting. I mean, there's a new type of young conservative man, and I actually think it's a relatively healthy reaction, though it can go off the rails. And that kid, when he was 12 or 13, was said, "You can be a woman, and actually your maleness is toxic." And those young kids those young men especially, are just like, they don't trust anyone over 30. They think institutions are corrupt. They think they've been lied to. They're reasserting themselves, as men tend to do. So we've had institutions trying to shape people in all sorts of unhealthy, unnatural ways.
Well, some of the irony of that, though, is that when you think of the examples that you would muster to support that point, it would be the Harvards and the Yales, right, which make a claim to a kind of universality in their student population. You can be anything here, but once you get here, we're going to rigorously police you, right? As opposed to, I was thinking about my alma mater when Yuval was speaking, right? It's a Southern College, Davidson, that had for generations produced lawyers, clergymen, and doctors, and that had an honor code that was, 100 some years old, right? You could only UVAs can rival it, right? And that produces a kind of person, and it attracts a particular kind of person, right? And so it seems to me the army is doing something similar, which is saying we only want a particular kind of person, and we're going to make you into the sort of person that, truth in advertising, right? Whereas maybe some of these other institutions, by virtue, there's a kind of deception there that they're claiming to be universal, right? While actually, perversely forming the person.
This will get me in trouble, but the slogan of my college at Notre Dame, the College of Liberal Arts, is study everything, do anything.
Yeah.
Totally. Like, we don't know anything. Come perform.
Yeah. In the train station here, I took a picture of it. There's a university, actually it's in sort of my backyard, Westchester, and they had a big ad and it just said, "Pursue your passions." And it was Westchester University. And I'm like,
sell your bonds. Yeah. I mean, look, I think that there's a way in which the concerns of those young men that you point to argue for the opposite of what they too often seek, right? They argue for respectable institutions, not for anti-institutionalism. And those very people will find those institutions appealing. So that I think sometimes it's just the case, and there are elements of this in Tocqueville too, where what we need is the opposite of what we're asking for. And to understand what we need to think a little more deeply about the nature of the human person, and again, about what we're missing, not what we have too much of. We have a natural tendency to say, liberate me from this, and sure, we should liberate these people from Harvard, I agree with that. But in order for them to be able to be formed by more worthy institutions, that second part of it takes real work. And I think that's the part where we have to persuade ourselves and persuade other people that ultimately a free society can't work if we're all against all the institutions. Because a free person is not just a natural phenomenon. A free person is a social achievement. And that requires a society that is geared to producing that kind of person, and all kinds of institutions that take that work seriously. So we can't, anti-institutionalism isn't going to get us out of the trouble of misformed institutions.
Yuval, how do we reform or have a new class of people who will take charge of our institutions? I mean, let me rephrase that as a question. How much of our failures of institutions are failures of those who have been leading our institutions?
Yes. Well, I think they're inseparable from each other, and so the failure is a failure of a generation of American elites who have not wanted to take responsibility for their part in our society as its elites. And there again, the solution is not simply anti-elitism, though I am anti these elites. The solution is to think about what our leaders should be and what they should be trying to do. And ultimately, it's a matter of education, it's a matter of formation, it's also a matter of each of us thinking, what part can I play in improving some set of institutions that I have a hand in, because we're all involved in one way or another in formative institutions that matter to the rising generation. And so I think we can't escape that. We have to see, even to the extent that the problem is this sort of generation of elites that's failed our society, we can't stand to the side and say they caused the problem. We have to understand the ways in which we are part of they and take some role in changing the way institutions function. Everybody has to do that.
Your answer to this question, I think, is going to be both and, but would like I'm thinking of education, especially grade school education, is the best path forward. Let's just create new institutions. I mean, there's this burgeoning movement of new classical schools emerging, or is it we need to take back the old institutions and
right.
and
yeah, I think these things work together, right?
Yeah.
They naturally work together. It's hard for me to say we should just abandon the public schools and start new, because that's where 80% of the kids are. That means abandoning them, and I don't think we should be prepared to do that. So you have to fight for the public schools, but you also have to build alternatives that create models that maybe those schools will learn from. I think the history of higher education is an example of that. All of the late 19th century universities, Stanford and Chicago and Duke and so on, they created models that then transformed the existing elite universities. The Ivy Leagues changed in the direction of those universities because they were clearly doing something better. I think that's the way to think about higher education now, and the way to think about education in general. And
I think AI will very quickly make some of these changes for higher education, right? Yeah. The advice, learn to code and get a computer science degree, that was given out 10 years ago, right? What if your computer science degree can't keep up with the way Claude is changing every week, right? Yeah. That's going to really, but I think it's going to change the shape of the research university, and it's also going to, job situation, all these sorts of things. But for those of us who come from a liberal arts background, we're having to think about, how do we recommit to the permanent things in this changing higher education landscape?
I wonder the aristocratic element of the soul, or the part of the society that Tocqueville now celebrates and now can sometimes criticize, like the passage I mentioned that you would call the America's the democratic aristocratic soul. That's education is one of those areas where I think it should come to reign a little bit more confidently, in this, not just in the sense of not disrespecting, for example, its own canon, which was something even like Herbert Marcuse in the 60s recognized. There's this very famous episode where black student radicals raised their hand at Marcuse and said, why should we read, whatever the Western canon? And he's like, there's just a certain number of things that you should read, whether you're black or white. And actually, if you read it, it can be a service to your emancipatory projects and so on. So that's part of it. But also just, I think maybe Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of being a properly aristocratic institution in a democratic context is just doing what you're supposed to do. We have too much institutional drift where like the police has to do mental health. The mental health worker has to police. The school is activism. The activist is an educator. The post office is the, you know what I mean? Is like, part of it is just like, this is the duty that's been assigned to me and I'm going to carry it out to the ends. I think the way he describes the professions in America, at least in his time, reflect that, and the way that professions have functioned since then is a betrayal of that.
I think there's not just institution or activity creep horizontally, but it's also vertically, right? Such that, I have many wonderful students, right? Some of them have more spelling errors than they should as college students, right? And so, it's interesting to read Tocqueville on education, thinking about just how different. I mean, he says
they're writing their own papers if they have spelling errors.
Every time I get, I
a lot of M dashes.
No, I mean I have a deep joy in my heart every time I receive a paper that is genuinely a college student's paper. I'm like, you have integrity. You are learning to think and write for yourself. This is beautiful.
Unless they asked AI, put a few spelling errors in here.
You didn't just work hard. You showed up. You're present.
Right,
this kind of ChatGPT style.
That's where the oral exam is a real good
coming
thing.
Back,
but
right?
But the Tocqueville, the educational world that he's describing is one in which very few people learn their Latin and Greek at university. And most people have a technical education, right? But that's against the backdrop of a much higher standard of ordinary K-12. I mean, he famously describes being at the, being out in the West and coming across a house that has Shakespeare and the Bible, right? And so the default learning is higher in some of these core areas than you might have assumed for his period of time, right? And that I think is certainly higher than the default knowledge of Shakespeare today, right? And so how I mean, I'm a college professor. I love what I do. I love my students, right? But again, with AI and this question of how do you form a new elite, I think some of it has to involve forming non-elites, forming ordinary people better at the most basic levels, right? In middle school, in high school, right? And that's not an easy task to take on, but it seems to me absolutely necessary.
And Sarah, we're about out of time, but I want to give you the last word. So you've devoted your life to teaching and studying Alexis de Tocqueville. So what for you is sort of, as you're doing this week by week with students, what are you hopeful about, or why is Tocqueville sort of the muse that you're using to engage students in our current moment?
Again, he teaches them to think philosophically and creatively about politics. I think that's desperately needed, right? I think, whether Tocqueville could be said to be a liberal who's also maybe the first post-liberal, insofar as that he sees what's possibly, could go off the rails in a liberal democratic order, right? And that sort of both and approach to thinking about politics, I think, is very healthy, and it helps to develop a vision for what's politically possible, right? Too often, whether it's because of reasons of ideology or I don't know, I think we get locked into thinking that the way in which we live today is the only way, right? And Tocqueville, in displaying to us very nicely the differences between the aristocratic and the democratic, right, trains the mind in that kind of creative and visionary thinking. And that's something I very much hope to impart to my students when I read him in the classroom.
Thank you for watching Project Cosmos, Conversations on the Future of Civilization, which is a production of ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. If you're a student, professor, or lifelong learner who wants to get more involved with ISI, visit isi.org or follow us on social media to learn more about our education educational programs that teach the foundations of Western and American civilization and what it means to be a great and good man or woman today. That's isi.org, or like and follow us on social media. Thank you.